Good morning. Thank you for coming out on this dreary morning. I know it's going to be very much worth your while. The first order of business is to silence your cell phone. I want to commend you on that. I can't remember the last time that we had anybody's cell phone ring during a bucket course class. And you get the credit for that. I hope I haven't jinxed it now. Thank you for doing that. We are honoring our veterans this morning, whether it's the Korean War or Vietnam or World War II. We tried to catch all of you to put name tags on, and we would like you to stand up and receive our gratitude this morning. Would you stand up, please, veterans? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You will notice that the veterans have name tags on, and if you see them during the break, you can give them your personal gratitude for what they have done for our country. And now we are ready for the second class of Jim Ahrens' course on Vietnam. So here's Professor Jim Ahrens.
Well, how do you hear me back there? Greg here's okay. Up here in front, is this one okay? Merle, you usually tell.
Well, so far.
Okay. We'll go from there. To start off with, I'd like to honor and recognize a personal friend of mine, Congressman Ike Skelton, former Congressman Ike Skelton, who was chair of the House Armed Services Committee, and a great friend of the military who passed away 2 days ago. And he had polio as a youngster, and I suspect his later decline in mobility had a lot to do with that polio that he had suffered under. And unfortunately, polio seems to be making its resurgence in the areas of most conflict nowadays. But Ike did a great deal for the military services and the servicemen in it. It was always his primary responsibility that he saw it. And I had the privilege of educating 2 of his sons in college, and he was an ideal parent, a highly supportive parent to have behind you. So we will miss, those of us in the service will miss him. In a national insurrection, quote, the center of gravity to be destroyed lies in the person of the chief leader and in public opinion, and against these points the blow must be directed, unquote. That was written by Karl von Clausewitz in his book On War in 1832. And I would suggest to you that it's still as valid in 2013 as it was then. So we're going to talk about the nature of insurgency and something about combating insurgency. It's called known as counterinsurgency. And that was to be the mode of operation in Vietnam. I neglected to add a book to the references that I put in the first session, and I'll pass this one around. We can have a gander at it. It's by Lieutenant Colonel John Nagel, who was here last year at college having a debate with another fellow about insurgency, counterinsurgency, and how effective it has been. This book is entitled Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife. A very messy proposition. And this aphorism was first enunciated by T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia in the 1920s. Lawrence had an excellent book that he came out with. He was a trained academician anyway, and got roped into guerrilla warfare during World War I in Saudi Arabia, or what's now Saudi Arabia. And afterwards he wrote a book called 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which is very much apropos to all of this. So I'm going to pass this around. You can take a gander at it and see how one guy thinks about it. But we found that insurgency is the most important aspect of military conflict during the last 40 years of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st century. So we're talking 50 years roughly. And the causes and the countermeasures that have been practiced around the world still have lessons that are good for us today. We're going to talk about the causes and characteristics of insurgency, and then we'll talk some about the factors involved in countering this, and if we have trouble in getting, we won't get to the last part of it, but if we can get to that, I want to offer a case study, we have time, on the American Revolution and its counterinsurgency aspects. Definitions are always important to start out with. Some of this is in government legalese. This one comes from Army Field Manual 100-20. It says it's an organized movement aimed at overthrow of a constituted government through the use of subversion and armed conflict. It's a condition resulting from a revolt or insurrection against a constituted government which falls short of civil war. There's one currently going on today in the Middle East that has gone over the line into civil war. And from Air Force Manual 1-1, their basic doctrine manual, it says insurgency movements seek to develop local support and external aid for subversive action against organized government. Their ultimate objective is control of the people. A synonym for this is revolutionary warfare. Counterinsurgency, on the other side, and often abbreviated COIN, COIN, it is the military, paramilitary, political, economic, psychological, and civic actions taken by a government to defeat subversive insurgency. Special operations and unconventional warfare could be part of this. Asymmetric warfare is another term you'll hear used for this. It's basically the little guy against the big fellow. Sometimes called the war of the fleet. Well, what are our elements and causes? That's what we're going to get down to in these next 5 slides here. They tend to be present in most of the prominently underdeveloped world countries, the third world countries. And they can also, some of these characteristics be seen in first and second world. Now, first, second, third worlds are descriptive terms used by the French. And it's sort of caught on into English. First and second world being Europe and places like the Balkans and well-developed industrial countries in the Middle East. The third world's everybody else. And in many cases, until just recently, they put China into that category. But given China's rapid and frantic pace of development, they're going to be out of that. And another term frequently used is called the revolution of rising expectations. And that's spread by communications. The transistor was one of the most important inventions of the 20th century. And we all know where that came from. And it makes it possible, with people running around with carrying boom boxes and other things plugged into their ears, the underdevelopment world sees what disadvantages they have. In other words, it makes them envious of what they have to look forward to. And they endure economic, political, and social areas that are very unappealing to them. So then we'll get into economic, political, social causes individually. Okay. All these here parcel of these elements of instability. Economic causes. That's the contrast between the very rich and the very poor in all sorts of underdeveloped areas, like in Latin America and the Arab and Middle Eastern countries, Asian countries, Africa and its former colonies. You see all these things. One I can cite is one flying into Caracas, Venezuela, and on the hillsides around the town are these very well-established white painted compounds with barbed wire across the top, and what it amounts to is that people see these who live just down the road, literally just down the road into the valley, see what's up a hill and how their life in these tar paper shacks and put together packing crates is like. So it's not hard to contrast that. Then sometimes another economic cause is the sacrifices that are demanded for industrialization and for development. After all, you have to concentrate on building things like infrastructure. You don't build things for people. You build things on the ultimate development of the country. Examples of this were, say, for example, the kulaks in Russia after Stalin got started with his first 5-year plan. These were the farmers who were prosperous, who were getting ahead in life, and they came up against Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. And Stalin shipped them off to Siberia, and most of those people caused later a Soviet Union shortage of meat and breeding stock because they slit the throats of their animals before they were herded off and before they were shot down. You see the same things that happened in Indonesia and in India as well, and in the People's Republic of China. And another thing has to do with exploitation. Exploitation that came about during the colonial periods, where plantation economies gave advantage and money and resources that were taken back to Europe. Also comes in this line land reform. That was one of the biggest things in pre-Red China and in the Philippines and in Vietnam. All this demand was that where few people owned the land and many people were the ones who had to farm it and had to accept what they could eke out of their share of the farmland. Political causes. Well, there's colonialism and its vestiges. Indochina had plenty of this. The French, of course, we talked about how they helped colonize the place from the mid-1880, the mid-1800s on. The British had held Malaya for years and years. The French regarded Algeria as their own domestic province. It didn't matter, it had just a small lake between metropolitan France and the people in Algeria. Portuguese Angola, Chechnya in more recent times. These vestiges of colonialism are highly resented by people. Backward government, it's another one of the causes. A powerful top side and a weak or corrupt bureaucracy in between, with poor communication between them and the mass of people. Lots of things to be ashamed of. In most of Asia, the squeeze is a constant way of doing business. One provides certain remuneration to officials to get them to do their job. You see this in Afghanistan today. It's going on. Pakistan is the same way. And you'll find autocratic and repressive governments. Go back a few years in history to Batista in Cuba before he was overthrown by Fidel Castro. Papa Doc Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude both ruled Haiti. Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Robert Mugabe today in Zimbabwe, which used to be known as Rhodesia. And there's no confidence in many of these governments that they'll solve the problems of the people. We see the inequities going on year after year. The same thing happens. There are people doing things about this. Now, a fellow named Greg Mortensen has been building schools in Afghanistan for women who were by doctrine shut out, and custom has kept them in the home. Also years of war and unrest, and the infrastructure crumbling, and most able source of money is the drug trade. The raising of poppies is a very profitable motive for farmers in Afghanistan. And then, of course, you've had the outsiders coming in. The British had a dismal record in Afghanistan. The Soviets had an even more dismal record in the 1980s. The British back further than that. Interestingly enough, if you read an account by Winston Churchill, written in about 1898, somewhere in that neighborhood, Churchill had voluntarily gone along just to see what was going on an expedition into the Afghanistan area. And much of the conditions that we've seen in recent years in Afghanistan were repeated against that expedition. You know, things don't change in many parts of the world. Social causes. Here's a whole laundry list of examples of this type of thing. Class and ethnic strife. Malayans versus the Chinese. In Nigeria, the Yoruba versus the Igbo. In Rwanda, the Hutu versus the Tutsi. In Sudan, you have the Arabs in Darfur against the blacks in the south. In the former Russia, you had the Great Russians versus about 20-odd different minority groups in that country before it came apart. And then, of course, we have religious strife. In Ireland, in Yugoslavia, for example, the Serbs, Eastern Orthodox, use a Cyrillic alphabet. They're closely aligned with Russia. The Croats, they are Roman Catholic in religion, and they use a Latin alphabet, and they look to Germany and Austria for their inspiration. And of course, the Bosnian Muslims are Islamic, and they speak Arabic or use an Arabic language. Sunni versus Shia conflicts are at there, and also in Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. So there's plenty to fight about in terms of religion. And of course, race. The black population in South Africa finally overcame, and in Rhodesia they did as well, now called Zimbabwe. And then Kenya. Kenya is still suffering from some of that, and other outside groups take advantage of this. Witness the shopping center massacre that occurred. Well, all this leads to dissatisfaction, loss of hope, and articulation that comes about from a leadership. So now we see where the cause comes into this. If you're going to create an opposition insurgency, you've got to have certain things going for you. And I'll try and outline some of these for you here. For one thing, it needs to be popular. It's got to have a lot of supporters, like any political movement. It also has to have a chance of success. A negative example might be an African-American insurgency in the United States because of the low numbers, percentage of the population, and acculturation over many years since the Civil War. The Black Panthers gave it a try without much of any success in the 60s and 70s. The cause should not be stolen by the government. Ramon Magsaysay, president of the Philippines, gave them a land reform. And in Mindanao, they took away land from, and with compensation, of course, for the people that owned it and redistributed that land to individuals. They were pushed by an insurgency by the Hukbala group, and Magsaysay, on the advice of an American, taught him a number of things to do. For example, the 10 centavo telegram. They could pay a very nominal price to send a telegram to an address in the government and basically drop a dime on guerrillas and insurgents and subversives. And the cause can be stolen by modern governments too. Somewhere in the 1880s, Bismarck in Germany initiated a medical plan, and somewhat reminiscent of the conflict that's going on in recent years here. Bismarck was successful, and he took away from the Marxists a social plan that he now, as a German government, could take credit for. So it can come at both upper and lower levels. The cause also should be one that's long-lasting. You have to attract firm supporters in this. It's no great pleasure to rise in revolt against your own government. It takes a good deal of courage to do this. Guerrilla warfare, it contributes these things. It is used sometimes to polarize countries. For example, terror bombings, killings, which gather adherents or neutralize opponents, make them fearful for their own fate. It's one way to gravitate people to your cause. And it all has to be put on the backs of an insurgent leadership. And that insurgent leadership has to focus and articulate whatever dissatisfactions are there and provide alternatives. And it's best, of course, if these are local people. And if they can put together a front, they will be able to use that. Well, another characteristic or help is geographic conditions. Outside support. Both of these are related to one another. Isolation, for example, is the place where the guerrillas and the insurgents are going to operate next to a friendly nation for sanctuary and aid. Virtually no insurgency in the latter part of the 20th century has been successful unless it has been able to generate aid and assistance from outside. Terrain has something to do with all of this. Is there a remote sanctuary? Fidel Castro went into his Oriente province of geographic upcountry and hid out there before they finally were able to move out and take over the rest of the country. Pakistan has its northwestern frontier mountains, the so-called tribal areas. a common place of disruption. A large country may have weak control over its environs and the climate. Can you live in a world like Eskimos might have to live in if they were mounting an insurgency in frozen country? It has to be a salubrious climate as well. And finally, outside support. You can generate sympathy for all kinds of people. For example, during the years of the troubles in Nigeria, great sympathy for the Biafrans was generated in the United States on humanitarian grounds. Support for the Irish Republican Army from the United States' Irish community, people who hated the British. The Kurds in the United States received a great deal of sympathy in the wake of the first Gulf War, which is why Operation Provide Comfort came about, as the Allies were forced into deploying people in the north of Iraq to take care of those people who had fled Saddam Hussein's Air Force and possibility of a renewed chemical weapons attack. And they all left their villages and their cities, some pretty good sized cities there, and went into the mountains. There were maybe 450 to 500,000 of these people up camping on the mountainsides in virtually no facilities. That's why we ended up being deployed into that area. And as an unlikely prospect, I ended up commanding a refugee camp of about 20,000. They issued us that many of them, and we had to deal with them with the help of a number of people, along with American troops. There were British and French and Italians, and these all did yeoman work in taking care of these people. And there were 3 other camps. So you can see the size of the operation that can develop so quickly. And other things like political pressure and technical assistance helps out. Aid, equipment, and advisors come about by people passing on this technology to them. Iran, for example, has passed on to Al-Qaeda in Iraq the capability and the knowledge about how to build an improvised explosive device, including one which is highly effective in penetrating armored vehicles. So all of these things help. Now, what do you do if you're going to start one up? Here's the primer, how to do it. Create a party. Most people like parties. These are political ones. People are your most important asset. Mao Zedong said that the gorilla moves as the fish in the sea, and the party is the tool that's used to focus the action. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, otherwise known as Lenin, in Russia in the 1917 revolution, he believed in an elite party, a small group of people who would then lead all the rest of them, and if not lead, drive all the rest of them to overthrow, and they did so very successfully in the carnage of 1917 World War I. You should create a united front. In other words, gather your various and sundry people together behind a cause. We call it here in Congress, I think, bipartisanship. Everybody gets into the act that way. If you can find an issue around which everybody can agree, Politics makes strange bedfellows is an old saying that is very apropos. For example, in Indochina, the left, the right, moderates, the religious groups, all backed the Viet Minh against the French. They had a tremendous desire for independence. From that then comes guerrilla warfare. And here's where it gets a little bit technical. I got just about enough time for a break to get through this phase. Guerrilla warfare is natural. In the view of revolutionaries, violence is necessary to harden the soldiers and the supporters, and to scare into silence any other that might be dissidents. Mao Zedong was a prolific writer, and some of his books are extant. I started looking at them in the early 1960s, and lo and behold, they came about in the 1980s and 90s as reprints. People trying to persuade people in the army and in the political world that this guy knew what he was talking about, and that's what the threat was coming from. He wrote, and this is a fairly longish quote, and it has a Chinese flavor to the way it's expressed, or at least a Chinese flavor that has been given to us by those people who translate these kinds of writings. Quote, Mao, in guerrilla warfare, select the tactic of seeming to come from the east and attacking from the west. Avoid the solid. Attack the hollow. Attack, withdraw, deliver a lightning blow, seek a lightning decision. When guerrillas engage a stronger enemy, they will withdraw when he advances, harass him, and when he stops, strike him, and when he is weary, pursue him when he withdraws. In guerrilla strategy, the enemy's rear, flanks, and other vulnerable spots are his vital points, and there he must be harassed, attacked, dispersed, exhausted, and annihilated. Unquote. Gives you some idea of what this little book has in it. The guerrilla slowly steps up the violence because he can pick the time. He can often pick the place. And the three phases of Mao call for the guerrilla to, one, operate in the mountains for safety. In the language of the new Army Field Manual 3-24, it says that is the strategic defensive phase where he can organize, prepare the population for his campaign, infiltrate the government and civilian institutions. He can establish undercover intelligence. He can gain operational and logistic support. This is where he solicits and obtains funds, such as Stalin did in pre-1917 Russia as a bank robber. And he would knock off banks and shipments of the Tsar's money around and finance the revolution. Develop also sources for outside support. Illegal arms dealers are all valuable. They're only in it for one thing, and that's money. And they'll provide anything they possibly can to anybody who's willing to pay for it and can do it so they don't get caught. And of course, then they organize strikes in order to get things done against both military and weapon-based strikes. In phase 2, Mao says, he goes into the war of movement phase. This is the creation of an insurgent regular army. This is what's called in modern language, the strategic stalemate. There are examples more modern than Mao's. Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq developed what he called the Mahdi army, which had a sort of a religious sense, and I'm not going to go into. There's Hezbollah in Palestine. These things create a Shiite identity against a weak and a pluralist type government. And this area here of this strategic stalemate or movement has to be done at just the right time. And if it's not the right time and they try it, don't be afraid to go back to a lower stage. Give you time to build up to get done what you need to get done. Mao built during his time of strategic stalemate the government of a whole province called Yunnan in China. It's sort of central northwest area. And he was law in that land. And the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek had little influence there. So they had practice of governing. And then, finally, they will burst out into, in phase 3, an annihilation campaign or strategic counter-offensive. And they have developed civil administration, military organization, social and economic development, all of which then leads to the strength to maintain a war of movement which would go out into the world. And as a result of this came China's People's Republic of China in the 1948-49 era, precipitating a huge argument within the United States, ultimately leading to McCarthyism. And then later in Vietnam, 1975, the big ticket war really boiled over, and they just simply rolled up like a carpet the government in Saigon. Ho Chi Minh added another phase to this. Ho's fourth phase, that was the enemy's homeland. By using propaganda and military reverses, they persuaded the French to give in 1954. And although Ho didn't live to see it, the same thing happened to cause the United States to give in 1973. And this eventually, by the way, or previously had happened in the American Revolution. And we'll look at that if we get to the time of that, and I think we will. The comparison between the American Revolution and the Vietnam task that the British had in putting this down. So then we'll get into counterinsurgency operations. I think it's probably time. Let's go before I start another topic here. Let's start and have a coffee break.
Thank you for taking your seats again. We are now ready for the second half of Jim's course of class on Vietnam. Jim Ahrens.
Okay, well, in the last section, I went over some of those slides fairly rapidly, and I was wondering if anybody wants a copy of those slides, I can email them to you and attach them to an email. If you'll give me your address, do it separately, afterwards we'll write them down, those that want it. But you can have to expect that as an attachment. Always be very chary about opening attachments to stuff. I'll warn you that if I'm sending you something, it will be those slides if you want request them. And I've no problem on people using it one way or another. I don't. If I retain a copyright on any of this stuff, I willingly let people use it. Now we're going to talk about counterinsurgency operations. And it's fairly brief. It's hard to write down all of these things. And in reading Nagel's book there, you'll see that he had written and studied these elements of insurgency and counterinsurgency for years before. But when he wrote the book, he had not been to Iraq. And in Iraq, he ended up as for part of his tour as a operations officer for a tank regiment, where he and his troops got to put into effect a lot of these things that he had written about earlier. And in the foreword to the second edition of that book, he outlines where he did and did not score a mark, which is a mark of a good author anyway. He's honest about it. Let's go into some of the Cold War options.
Cold water if you want.
Yeah, Cold War and cold water about the same. Direct action. That's easy to take. Just go out and arrest them. Difficulty to do that in a democracy. You can arrest the leadership, you can ban their organization, and then it may lead into repression and play into the hands of the other side's propagandists. T.E. Lawrence, in one of his aphorisms, said that the most important weapon that one has is a printing press. And the United States Army has adopted some of that. As a matter of fact, they have specifically designed for requirements a printing press, a printing unit that is airdroppable once. But it's a useful tool to have, certainly is, as long as people can read whatever language there is. Indirect action, now that's where you deprive them of some of their cause. Find what the problems are and solve them. They did it in the Philippines with the hooks, land reform, making the bureaucracy responsive, controlling the police and the armed forces so that they're not demonstrating obnoxious conduct. One of the biggest things in Vietnam, I'm told, was that the Vietnamese army, the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, this is acronym, had a penchant for stealing chickens. They went all over and they supplemented their rations with all the chickens they could find. I don't know what that bodes for the Brunel's attempt at legalizing chicken raising. Another thing you can do is to infiltrate the movements. The FBI infiltrated the Communist Party of the United States so that there were people reporting others as being communist agents who were really infiltrators. So it was really quite a time to do it. And if you happen to be from a different racial group, it's rather hard to infiltrate some of these native organizations. Strengthen your political machine. That does more good than anything else, in devoting time and effort into civic action. In other words, these are the people where the rubber meets the road. That's where you build ties with the masses of the population by doing things for them that they need to have done and want to have done. And not just steal the chickens. There are other hot war options. The strengthening of the police and the army. Show people that the government can protect them. In Malaya, which was a peculiarly racial makeup there, the Malays were protected by putting the Chinese populations, who were the main ones causing trouble, putting them into separate living quarters. And that has been suggested as a means of controlling people ever since that time. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Strategic hamlets sometimes pay off in reverse. There's a case in South Africa after the Boer War where the British had attempted to lock up all of the Dutch Boer settlers there so they could keep an eye on them inside barbed wire. And all that did was to build intense reaction, intense resentment from that population and hurt the British efforts at the counterinsurgency movement very much. In other words, like our prison system, this was sort of a finishing school for amateur criminals. Well, it became a finishing school for amateur guerrillas in the Boer War. There have been people who compared the British in South Africa and the Americans in Vietnam as similar type situations. Also, cultural insensitivity is something else that comes about as trying to use an army in a civilian policing role. The next step is very elementary. Get an early success. You got to give them something to cheer about. Propaganda advantage, you've got to have it if you're going to use that printing press. The military victory or political reform. Probably the political reform would have probably more effect. And then gear up for a long war. Reorganize your army into light, highly mobile units. Use aircraft for ground support. Long endurance aircraft, but you've got to be awfully careful about how this is employed to avoid collateral damage. What is the utility of using drones? Are we creating more enemies than we ever thought possible by the collateral damage and seemingly unimaginable killing from on high? Well, those are questions that you have to take into account. And then indoctrinate the armed forces into a civic action mode. Convince them that they can make friends by restraining and their actions, the actions that count. That's what Mao was getting at in all of these things. Another quote from Mao. He said that there are 3 rules that your army has to follow, and 8 remarks. 3 rules. All actions have to be subject to command. You can't delegate it down to the lowest level. Number 2, don't steal from the people, which ought to be pretty self-explanatory, and be neither selfish nor unjust. Your reputation gets around. His remarks, now these are peculiar to the Chinese environment. Replace the door when you leave the house. We had many young GIs in the Grenada expedition that took great pleasure in kicking in doors to hunt out what they thought were Cuban sympathizers and found some. Number 2, roll up the bedding on which you slept. Be courteous. Be honest in your transactions. Return what you borrow. Replace what you break. Do not bathe in the presence of women. Do not, without authority, search the pocketbooks of those you arrest. Well, very practical rules, adapted to, of course, a Chinese milieu. Another thing you need to be able to do is to spotlight the indigenous armed forces. If you're a foreign advisor, it does little good, or at least not much good, for you to be given credit for and to be seen as doing those things for the civic action elements. Let the indigenous folks do every bit that they possibly can. If you got too many Westerners in an Asian environment, it looks like colonialism all over again. Paternalism. But if it's paternalism in a country, own natives and their own philosophy doing this, that's a little different. Confucian patronage and this kind of action was normal in Asia. which is why we are doing more in Afghanistan with this line of thought. The Afghan National Army is being trained and allowed to carry out those civic action roles that they're supposed to be carrying out. And in the meantime, the Taliban and their sympathizers are countering this by infiltrating agents into, and that's resulting in lots of friendly killings. And you have to look at that as a response to what's going on in building some success in what the Afghan National Army is doing or can do. And then last but not least, gear up for 80% political action and 20% military. Stay off of the force. Promote internal development and fix the problems that people are objecting to, but, I don't know, it's a big but, don't take credit for it in the wrong place. The locals are the ones that have to do it. And this is people-to-people work. Technology may not help much here in other than promoting logistics and support. And you better use gee whiz gadgets pretty carefully. They can backfire. The old rule of thumb is that you need a 3-to-1 superiority to attack a prepared position. In counterinsurgency, you need at least a 5-to-1 superiority in order to counter it. Okay, stop here for questions before I move on to the next one. And I've got to change files here on the thing. So, anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, so we're going to have about 20 minutes or so we can look at the American Revolution. I'm always feel rewarded by one of these things. I spent most of my teaching career using the Viewgraph transparency projector. And I've still got all the slides that I just had to convert to the new modern system. Well, the American Revolution is an interesting study. And I got into this after a little session once. I was treated to a 30-day seminar at West Point that was geared for instructors of military history in the ROTC program. And we had people from, there was about 30 of us, from all sorts of different colleges and universities. And we all knew what the historical facts and figures and all the events were. So we sat around and argued for 30 days on the interpretation of these remarks. It was one of the most fun courses I ever sat through. And some of this came out of that, and I'll try some of it on you and see how you react to this thing. But here again, we need to review a few things on the facts of the American Revolution. The American colonies had grown quite different. And they were fundamentally different from, and they were independent of Great Britain. And every one of them had their own character and characters. And they wanted a voice in the institutions and in Parliament. You know, taxation without representation was anathema to them. The English, though, they needed money. They had to. They had to pay for the garrison that they had now to support here in the Americas after the end of the French Revolution, the French and Indian War. That's the one that's sometimes called the 7 Years' War in Europe. In reality, if you think about it, it was the first world war, the first one that was fought worldwide between the Brits and the French. Continents in North America, in India and subcontinent, and in Europe, all over. So they had this money that they had to pay this new garrison. And they had those debts too that they had. They borrowed all kinds of money. They wanted the colonies to pay their own share. And the colonies had no desire for this. They wanted no army for defense from the British. They had their own militia. And the proclamation line had made them very irritable. The proclamation line set a geographic reference across the Appalachian Mountains, where the rivers on one side flowed to the west and the rivers on the east side flowed to the Atlantic. And that line marked the demarcation. Everything west of that line, according to the British, was Indian territory. Only they had access to that out there. And the Indians came raiding into Virginia and western Pennsylvania and western New York from those territories. And the colonists resented that, as you would guess they probably would. So they had no desire to make the Native Americans equal partners and living peacefully with them. So in order to raise money, the British had to tax. The old Molasses Act, which was a fairly limited amount of tax on every gallon of molasses that was brought back to England, or to more likely to the New England colonies, to make into rum, which was the favorite product, and the tax was fairly innocuous. But then it was replaced by the Sugar Act in 1764. The French and Indian War had ended in 1763. So now they're trying to collect much more money to come in. Then in 65, the Stamp Act. Everybody's heard about that one, I'm sure. And all I'm doing is reviewing your junior high American history here, basically. And they resented those taxes on various things, like put a stamp on playing cards, a stamp on documents that were created by lawyers, and so on and so forth. A very elemental way of raising money, pure profit. And that objection that happened to lead to all kinds of civic action and resentment was eventually repealed and replaced by what was known as the Townshend Act. And they taxed things like glass and tea and ink and so on. And that proved to be a provocation for the Boston Massacre in 1770. And then another bit of civil disobedience, the colonists burned a British revenue cutter called a Gaspé in 72. And then in Boston, New England, they repealed many of those acts and replaced them with the Tea Act. And that really got people's attention because it gave the East India Company a monopoly, and it was highly resented. That's why most people here in the United States drink this stuff instead of tea. And the Boston Tea Party was the outcome of that. People disguised as Native Americans dumped a bunch of tea in the harbor, and that brought the British coercive acts, which were called the Intolerable Acts in New England. And it brought the British to revoke the charter. And they sent a military presence there, much more than they had. Lieutenant General Thomas Gage was appointed governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was the commander-in-chief of British Armed Forces in the Americas. He was a hard-nosed CO. He did his duty as he saw it, and the result was open defiance and civic disobedience. And so that by April of 1775, a solution was beyond repair. Gage set out to capture the stocks of arms and leadership, and went out to Lexington and Concord. And the British operation there wound up being resisted. Paul Revere's Ride, you're all familiar with that. And he met, and all of the militia met on the common, and they happened to have a few drinks. They got there ahead of the British, and they took some time for refreshment in the tavern. And as a result of that, somebody fired the first shot. Nobody's ever known who. But as a result of that, 8 Americans were killed. And then the troops retreated, and they were harassed all the way back to Boston. And the British would take 73 killed and 26 missing and 174 wounded out of 1,800. The Americans' result was 49 killed, 5 missing, and 41 wounded for 93 total. And the siege of Boston began. And the war began in April of 1775, and the Declaration of Independence came in 1776, a bit over a year later on. Politics sometimes work slowly. Bullets move faster. Well, let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of the British and the Americans here. In terms of numbers, the British had a much larger population. They could draw on them for plenty of troops if they wanted to. But they depended primarily on volunteers and to a large extent on hired mercenaries from countries that the king was related to in Germany, like Hesse and Brunswick and Hanover. And after the war spread to other parts of the world, the British had to divide up their forces, and they were short. But the Patriot Army under George Washington, which never numbered more than about 18,000 troops at any one time, and they came and they went. In your discipline of the American Army, sometimes they were not disciplined at all. They were militia. The British, though, had regular forces, and they were definitely superior in training and in supply and logistics. The American forces were 2 types. There was the Army, the Continental Army, and the militia. Soldiers served only in the militia for 90 or 180 days on each enlistment, and they were poorly trained and disciplined by and large. The militia often would not serve outside of its own state, but it usually came alive in order to meet any kind of a local emergency, like Native American raids from the West. The Continentals were wedded to regular linear tactics to some degree. They were enlisted for disciplined service for the duration, and they developed some experience that paid off. Let's look at some of the other advantages and disadvantages. If you look at the American population as a whole, it's small. It's almost all concentrated right along the frontier of the near the frontier or back to the coastline. In terms of the Americans' view, this is John Adams' view of the Americans. 1/3 were patriotic, 1/3 were loyalists to the British, and 1/3 didn't give a damn. They just wanted to go along with their own lives. The logistics was of considerable importance because there was a very poor in America anyway of an infrastructure that could produce weapons. For example, most of the weapons were captured from the British. They did make Kentucky rifles through a very long and involved process. It was invented originally by the Pennsylvania Dutch or Germans, and they had produced good weaponry there, and they could actually bore out a rifle barrel with considerable accuracy. But there was no place on the continent of North America, or even South America, as far as I know, I'm much less familiar with their history, that you could cast a cannon. Every one of those cannons that the colonials used had to be captured from the British. They got them from such places as taking Fort Ticonderoga and Washington's artillery chief, dragged them over the mountains to be on the heights. What was it called? Let's see, Shane, what's the name of the heights there in Boston, where they mounted the cannon to force the British to evacuate?
Charleston, Dorchester?
Dorchester, that's the one. Yep. I do not need that. Okay. The other place we got our infrastructure and logistics supplies were from the French. The French connection was important. Seems to me there was a movie entitled by that name a few years ago, but I like to use it for this. And that French connection that we had was very, very valuable. But we didn't get it until after the victory at Saratoga. And the committee of 3 guys in Paris there, headed mostly by Ben Franklin, and another one was John Adams serving there. And I think John Jay also served with them, but they were the people who arranged this with the French government to support these rebels across the pond. Other things we had to get was intelligence. We had that, the Patriots had that, because they had the local loyalties. Mao Zedong described it as the guerrilla moving is sufficient to see. Then all you had to do is catch the fish in the sea. But they had no problems with this. They also had those overseas committees in Paris, for example, what I just described. And then the Americans had the advantage of what they considered to be the justice of their cause. That sound familiar? A whole bunch of folks in Vietnam prior to the 1975 victory had all kinds of people desiring one thing only, and that is independence. No foreigners stomping around in their territory. And we had the similar thing. The British, they had a large population in Britain, but a very small one in Canada, which was their main supporting base. The army of them had a large population base. They had professional soldiers from that. They had experienced leaders developed in the 7 Years' War, and plenty of mercenaries. The British also had logistics, and there's some advantages and disadvantages in here. Intelligence-wise, the Loyalist network was primary in what happened with the British gaining information or lack of information. And the British Loyalists in America really didn't want to participate in a war, and they were very patriotic to Britain, but not to the new Congress and to the new governments of the various states. There was in Britain considerable public support among the property classes. In Britain, you could only vote if you owned property. And most voting was into the 19th century was to take place in a county or town convention, basically of all the population, and as they called the roll, you voted one way or another. It's hardly called a secret ballot. But they did have, in fact, considerable support among them. Okay, so comparing these two here. Logistics, long distance away, British disadvantage. Diversion of resources. Control of population. The British could control these cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston for a while. All of these were under their control. The rural areas, primarily out in the woods and on the frontier, they were in the Patriot cause. The intelligence access, the loyalty of the native population was on the American side. The motivation of the native population was pretty much by their own people. Outside assistance, regular forces from France, and logistics from France. And the practicality of the task that they were looking for. And I'm rushing through this now at the end of this, was the primary motivation of the commercial interests that were profiting from the Americans. The support at home, the British voting public had a very narrow support, and the American voting public had a fairly broad one. Conclusions out of this, and just read off what I've thought about. The British faced many of the same problems that the Americans had in Vietnam. They were pressed for troops at the end of a long logistics pipe, and they had domestic competition for assets. Did you ever hear of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society? We and they controlled the urban areas, but little of the countryside, and constantly faced the problem of being spread too thin. The Americans had the same kind of thing in Vietnam as the British had in the Revolution. And we were facing motivated patriots who wanted independence, and we're both facing a lack of staying power at home for a long conflict. Whereas the natives who were holding out, they could stand as long as they needed to. And allies, in the American case in Vietnam, they were not all that motivated to help either. For example, there was no UN participation, as there seems to be now calling for in both times. Well, that's pretty much the conclusion. You can see the British and the Americans, at least in my view anyway, had a very strong relationship in their colonial situations or in their attempt at pacification of people who were opposing them. So that's as much as we got for today, and next time I'm going to get into how American presidents from Truman, Eisenhower, Johnson, Kennedy, Johnson, and then Nixon got involved in Vietnam and what they did and tried to do. That's pretty fair thing to bite off. So we'll see if we can get that all done in an hour and a half. And then on the last session, we'll do primarily what were the reactions to this and open it up for people's opinions and arguments if you want to make some of them. So we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jim. That's the end of our second class of our 4-week course on Vietnam. Remember to turn your cell phones back on, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for coming this morning.
Yeah.